Hi, everyone. I want to welcome you to episode 20 of No Longer Enslaved, where we have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. This is part 4 in my 7-part series called Transformation Through Spiritual Mapping. If you are new to my channel, I want to welcome you. I'm so glad that you found me. I want to encourage you to subscribe and make sure you hit that notification bell so that each time I post an episode, you will be notified. I do have a sense that I want to try and get these episodes out a little bit faster in this series because I just sense this urgency that the Lord wants me to do my best in trying to equip you all so that you can do the work of spiritual mapping. So I'm going to do my best to try and get through this series a little bit quicker than I did my last series. Also, if you are new, you may not be familiar with what spiritual mapping is. So I just want to give you a high-level overview. Essentially, spiritual mapping utilizes historical research, current demographics, will utilize prophetic revelation and strategic intercession really to release the redemptive purposes that God has for, whether it's a school, a business, an institution, a city, a state, a region, or a nation. What spiritual mapping does is essentially provides information about the spiritual atmosphere in a certain area. And what that does is it fuels our intercession so that we can strike at the root of the issues. Now, I love what C. Peter Wagner once said. He said, what an x-ray is to a surgeon, spiritual mapping is to an intercessor. Also, George Otis Jr., who's probably the foremost expert in spiritual mapping, he says that spiritual mapping can provide a kind of revelatory focus that sustains fervent and effectual prayer. When this intelligence is carried into spiritual warfare, God is released to provide an open door for ministry. So that kind of gives you just an understanding, a basic understanding of what spiritual mapping is. Now, in this episode, I'm going to be focused on the reconnaissance component of spiritual mapping. Now, I've shared this in my first episode in this series, part 1, that spiritual mapping has 3 components: reconnaissance, research, and informed intercession. So in today's episode, I'm going to focus on reconnaissance. And what I want to do is first begin to provide a biblical foundation for why we do reconnaissance. And then I will share a story of some reconnaissance that we've done as a spiritual mapping team. And also at the end, I want to share another mistake I made in the early years of doing spiritual mapping. So that's kind of the focus of today's episode. So to start with, let's look at the biblical foundation for why do we do reconnaissance. And thankfully, there are a number of examples all throughout Scripture because God's people really engaged in reconnaissance to understand, the spiritual layout of the land. So the first example that we have in Scripture is when Moses sent the 12 spies into the land of Canaan. And I'll read to you from Numbers 13. This is verses 1 through 2 and then 17 through 20. It says, the Lord said to Moses, send some men to explore the land of Canaan, which I'm giving to the Israelites. For each ancestral tribe, send one of its leaders. When Moses sent them to explore Canaan, he said, go through the Negev and on into the hill country. See what the land is like and whether the people who live there are strong or weak, few or many. What kind of land do they live in? Is it good or bad? What kind of towns do they live in? Are they unwalled or fortified? How is the soil? Is it fertile or poor? Are there trees in it or not? Do your best to bring back some of the fruit of the land. Now, I really like this passage because we can learn a lot just from these few verses. The first thing that we learn is that God gave a clear direction for Moses to send the spies into the land to do reconnaissance. And that's so important. We want to have a clear directive from the Lord before we go and do reconnaissance. Now, last episode, I shared one of the mistakes we made, and that was going into the Masonic temple doing reconnaissance without having a clear directive from the Lord. Unfortunately, what that did is that brought us this unnecessary spiritual attack because, we didn't have that clear directive. And I go into more detail in my previous episode on that. Also, from this passage, what we learn is that Moses gave some clear instructions as to what they were to look for. And I think this is so important when we do reconnaissance, is because we want to have, really defined parameters in what we're doing. We want to be clear about what our mission is so that we don't get distracted. One of the enemy's probably favorite strategies is to distract us. So just having those clear instructions, clear parameters before we go in and do reconnaissance. Now, Joshua was one of the 12 spies that went into the land of Canaan. So at heart, he was a spiritual mapper. And Joshua is probably one of my most favorite biblical characters. I've learned so much through his life over the years. And, later, when he was leading Israel into the promised land, he sent 2 spies into Jericho. And this is from Joshua 2, verse 1. It says, "Then Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim. 'Go, look over the land,' he said, 'especially Jericho.' So they went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab, and they stayed there." So here we see that Joshua is telling the spies to look over the land. Well, if we dig a little bit and try and understand what exactly is he asking them to do, the Hebrew word for look is ra'ah, and it means to perceive, to discern, to observe, and to see with vision. So really what Joshua is asking these 2 spies to do is not only use their physical eyes to observe what's going on in Jericho and what, the fortification of its walls and, what the people are like, all of that, but also to use their spiritual eyes. He wanted them to engage their gifts of discernment so that they could determine not only what was happening in the natural realm in Jericho, but also what was happening in the spiritual realm. Well, this really is what spiritual mapping reconnaissance is all about. It's engaging our natural senses with our spiritual senses and gathering that information that we get from using those different senses. Then later, when Joshua was dividing the land among the different tribes, he also sent out small teams into the land to do reconnaissance, and he gave them specific instructions. And this is in Joshua 18. I'll read verse 4 and then 8 and 9. It says, "Appoint 3 men from each tribe. I will send them out to make a survey of the land and to write a description of it, according to the inheritance of each. Then they will return to me." As the men started on their way to map out the land, Joshua instructed them, "Go and make a survey of the land and write a description of it. Then return to me, and I will cast lots for you here at Shiloh in the presence of the Lord." So the men left and went through the land. They wrote its description on a scroll, town by town, in 7 parts, and returned to Joshua in the camp at Shiloh. So here we see Joshua is giving them specific instructions of what to do. They're actually, mapping out the land itself. They're writing descriptions about it. And this really helps guide our reconnaissance. When we do reconnaissance, we want to take notes, because what reconnaissance is doing is we are gathering that essential information that will equip us to engage in effective spiritual warfare of cleansing the land. So that's what we can learn from this passage in Joshua. Now, in the New Testament, we see that Paul engages in reconnaissance when he goes to Athens. So what Paul does is he first, he wants to determine the spiritual climate of Athens so that he knows the strategy to bring forth the gospel in an effective way. And we read about this in Acts 17. This is verse 16, and then also verses 22 through 23. It says, "While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, 'People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship. And this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. So here in this passage, we see that Paul, he actually walks around the city gathering pertinent information about the spiritual condition of the Athenians. He was troubled by all the idols that he found in the city. But when he found that one altar that was named to the unknown God, what that did is that actually gave him strategy of how he could reach the Athenians by explaining to them that the God of heaven and earth, the one that created everything, that holds all things in his hand, that, we have our being in him. He was explaining to them who God is. And Paul actually quotes Athenian poets in his apologetics later in that chapter. And it's just a beautiful example of the effectiveness of reconnaissance. Because Paul did that reconnaissance ahead of time, he knew how to reach the Athenians and how to break through any barriers that were in their minds, veils over their eyes and ears. And so it's just really important to be able to do that reconnaissance leading up to sharing the gospel. Okay, so I want to transition a little bit to talk about a story or a time that we did reconnaissance as a spiritual mapping team. And it's probably the most elaborate reconnaissance that we've done as a team over the years. And the reason why I want to share this with you is because it just gives you a good idea of what can be accomplished through reconnaissance. Now, some of you may have watched my interview on Carmen Studer's show. I think it was the most recent interview I did with her, where I talked about praying for our schools. And in particular, praying what we did with spiritual mapping and praying for Riverton High School. So if you haven't seen that video, I will actually include a link in the description box below, because I want you to hear the full story. Because today in this episode, I'm only going to share about the research component, about the reconnaissance component of that spiritual mapping project. So make sure you listen to the whole story, because it's just so beautiful how God wove everything together to see breakthrough at this school. So just to give you a little bit of background, in 2006, we were given an opportunity to pray for, at the time, what was the largest high school in the state of Utah. So the faculty and students at Riverton High School, they were devastated because there were just a number of deaths among students in the 2006-2007 school year. Well, following the suicide of a close friend of one of our youth guys, because I was the youth minister at the time in 2006, when his best friend committed suicide, that opened up an opportunity for me to meet with the principal at Riverton High School. And, I explained to him that I'm a youth minister, but also I'm part of a team of people that recognize there's a spiritual dynamic that can negatively impact students. And so I offered that our team could come and help. We could pray throughout the school, cleanse the school of that negative spiritual dynamic, and then also release the blessings that God has intended for the school and the faculty and the students. Well, the principal was absolutely relieved to have our help. He was enthusiastic about us coming. In fact, he said, you can come anytime you want. Just let me know ahead of time, and I will make sure that every, room you have access to that you want to be able to go into. Well, this was huge because the principal carries the highest level of authority over that school in the natural realm. And so when he was giving us unrestricted access and unrestrained permission to engage in spiritual warfare for the students and the faculty, it really, what that did is that increased our level of authority in the spiritual realm. So that's what led us to be able to do the spiritual mapping at Riverton High School. And so over the next year and a half, what we did is we went 7 different times. Now, the first 3 times is what I'm going to focus on, because that was our reconnaissance trips. And, one of the things that was beautiful is the Lord used our spiritual mapping team to be able to equip others throughout this journey that we had at Riverton High School. So the first reconnaissance trip, we just went as a spiritual mapping team. and we took notes and we discerned what was there. When we came back from that particular trip, we had a meeting and we recognized that not only, was the Lord opening the door for us to do this spiritual mapping at Riverton High School, but he also was calling us to equip and train young people in understanding how to walk in their gifts of discernment and how to engage in prophetic intercession. So that's what we did. All the rest of the trips, we had young people. We even had a sixth grader and a fifth grader join us at one point, because we wanted to use this as an opportunity to train others. And it was so amazing because not only did we have young people come with us from, the youth group that I was leading, we had youth from other churches in the valley come as well. We had people from other states come, and even a team from Italy. I mean, God just orchestrated it amazingly. So it was a phenomenal time. Now, I want to share a little bit more in detail about our reconnaissance. So the second time, our second and third trip, which were our two big reconnaissance trips, what we did is we broke into smaller groups of at least 3 people. And I gave each group a map of the school, and then I sent them to specific areas within the school. So essentially, I knew that we would have a team cover, each of our teams would cover the entire school. Now, I also gave them a reconnaissance note sheet, and essentially this just was a place where they could, write down the specific location they were in and then what they discerned. And that's what you see here in this picture that I'm showing you. Now, one of the things that I knew was important is that we never wanted to send the same team to the same location. So each reconnaissance trip, I made sure that different people were going to different locations. And what that did is that provided us with confirmation. Because if different teams discerned the same thing in the same location, then we knew that we were spot on, and that brought that level of confirmation. So after we finished the reconnaissance trips that we did, I then compiled all the notes, and that's what you see here. Now, this is just the first page of all the notes that I compiled, but this was really helpful because what I did from there is I then went back to the map, the school map, and I color-coded the different spirits that we had discerned. And that's what you see in the top left corner there. It's a little bit hard to see just because of the colors. But then on the map, with the corresponding color, I wrote notes as far as the location of each of these spirits that we had discerned with a corresponding number to the reconnaissance notes. So hopefully that makes sense. It just was a way for us to identify, okay, in what location is a spirit of witchcraft operating? And what reconnaissance notes does this coincide with? So that if we had more questions, we could go back to, all the notes that I had compiled and look for more details there. Now, just to kind of give you a bit of an overview of what we discerned that there were spirits of witchcraft, depression, death, sexual perversion, and a predator spirit operating at the school. And more specifically, there were definitely areas in the school that, had a very strong dark presence, and I'll mention some of those. So initially, when you walk into the school, the main entrance, just inside, there are 2 wolf statues. Now, the mascot of Riverton High School is the Silver Wolves, and so that's why they have these statues. Well, in these statues were watcher spirits, and it was a very intense presence there. Then the hallway leading to the counseling offices, we had people discern that there were watcher spirits actually traveling in the walls. When intercessors put their hands on the wall, they could feel movement in the wall. And then one of the intercessors was able to see a wolf traveling up and down that wall. Now, every single team that went in that hallway that led to the counseling office, they had this sense of hopelessness, depression, sorrow, anguish, and grief. It was very tangible. Another dark area in the school was a particular math class. And when we went there, different teams went there, they literally, they sensed such a strong confusion and heartache that was over that room, and it brought chills to them. In fact, some of our intercessors were actually moved to tears because of the intensity of the heartache. Well, later we come to find out that that's the class our youth guy had with his best friend that had just committed suicide. And so you could feel the anguish and the heartache. I mean, it was permeable in that atmosphere. Another classroom that was particularly dark, this teacher had posters up on the wall that just were awful. One of them said, if dumb was dirt, this class would cover about 10 acres. Talk about a curse and an insult. That is horrible. He also, I can't believe this, he also had a poster that said, I do like children, but it depends on how they're cooked. Now, this was back in 2006. I didn't realize how much satanic ritual abuse is happening in our valley. I didn't realize that cannibalism is actually happening as well. Had I known that then, I would have put two and two together. But even back then, when I didn't understand all that was going on, we were horrified by this poster. So that was definitely something on our radar. But the darkest location in the school was actually the faculty lounge. And we discerned that there was a portal there where there was dark spirits traveling in and out of that place. So the faculty lounge is located on the second floor of the high school, and it overlooks the student commons. Now, just through discernment, we could see images. The Lord gave us visions of some of the teachers overlooking the student commons and actually picking out their next targets. In this student lounge or faculty lounge, we also discerned watcher spirits were there. And probably most disturbing was that several of us discerned that rape had occurred in this room. And so you have these spirits of deception, sexual immorality, domination, and intimidation operating from this place. So I share these things because what the reconnaissance did for us is it helped us gather the information of what's going on in the natural realm and what's going on in the spiritual realm at this school. And we then took that information and just brought it before the Lord and asked the Lord to give us divine strategy of how to cleanse the school of the defilement that's happened and how to drive out the spirits that had encamped there. And he did. He gave us amazing strategy. And that's why I want you to listen to that interview I did with Carmen Studer, because I describe it all there. But I just wanted to kind of give you an idea of what reconnaissance can look like and what can be accomplished when we do reconnaissance. Now, as promised, I'm going to tell you about another mistake I made in the early years of doing spiritual mapping. So one day, the Lord gave me a vision. And in this vision, I saw a territorial spirit that was over Lookout Peak, kind of up near the University of Utah, for those of you that are familiar with our valley. And after I got this vision, our next spiritual mapping meeting, I shared it with the team. And, one of the other intercessors and I decided that we were going to go up to Lookout Peak and do some reconnaissance. Well, I made the mistake of thinking that because the Lord had showed me this revelation, that it was then time to go deal with it. Well, this couldn't have been further from the truth. It was not the Lord's timing. And he made it very clear to us because as my friend and I were driving up there in her car, we were on I-215 and her car broke down. Her engine seized. We had to pull over, to the side of the road on the freeway, and we were stranded. We had to call her husband to come, rescue us. And unfortunately, her car was never the same. They had to buy a new vehicle. And I felt horrible because my immaturity in the prophetic and my immaturity in spiritual mapping actually cost them a vehicle. Now, they were incredibly gracious with me, and we realized this is just a really valuable lesson we all need to learn, and that is, it was not the Lord's timing for us to go up there. And, we have to recognize that this type of spiritual warfare can be very intense. And so she and I recognized, we are in the midst of a very intense spiritual battle over our valley. And the Lord protected us from actually making it all the way up there. Because had we gone up there, we both are convinced we would have experienced serious harm because we were going outside of the Lord's timing. Now, years later, well, maybe 2 or 3 years later, in 2004, the Lord orchestrated just this divine strategy to engage in strategic intercession at Lookout Peak. So, like I said, in 2004, our spiritual mapping team actually partnered with the United States Strategic Prayer Network. And we sent teams of local intercessors to 6 strategic locations throughout the Salt Lake Valley. And when we did that, we had intercessors from all over the nation agreeing with us in prayer. So I was one of those that went to Lookout Peak. I was, among a team of 3 of us that went. And when we first got there, it was, it was cold, it was dark, it was gloomy. There was these low-hanging clouds over the mountain, and the oppression was just absolutely tangible. Well, one of the strategies that the Lord gave us for as a team was, like I said, we had 6 strategic locations that the Lord had showed us throughout our valley that were connected almost like a spiritual grid. So we recognized that there were ley lines that were connected by these significant areas. And the Lord showed us to, at the same time, so this would have been 3:15 p.m. on a Sunday afternoon, November 14th, 2004. Intercessors at these 6 strategic locations, we drove tent pegs into the ground and began interceding for the land. So we did that, my team of 3 at Lookout Peak. We drove that tent peg into the land at 3:15. Then the next thing the Lord unveiled for us is he wanted us to actually scale the face of this hillside. And so we did. It was a little bit of a challenge, but we got up there. And when we got up there, we began shouting, "Behold, the King is coming! Behold, the King is coming!" And we drove another tent peg into the ground. And when that happened, we just erupted in worship, the 3 of us. I mean, it was such a beautiful moment. And we began singing a song that has lyrics that say, "Behold, he comes, riding in the clouds, shining like the sun at the trumpet's call. Lift your voice in the year of Jubilee. Out of Zion's hill, salvation comes." It was such a beautiful moment because the presence of the Lord just enveloped us. And literally the clouds parted and the sun came out. And the Lord gave us a tangible sign that we had shifted the atmosphere. We were victorious in reclaiming that territory and driving out the spiritual forces of darkness that had encamped there. And I am so grateful for that experience. My goodness, like how many years later, and I'm still tearful about it because it was so meaningful. And I'm just grateful that the Lord taught us this lesson, that he protected us from going outside of his timing with my friend's engine seizing up on the side of the freeway. And so we regrouped and we spent several years just saying, "Okay, Lord, we just lay it before you and you'll show us when the time was." And when that Kairos time came, it was so glorious. I'm so grateful that he taught us this. Sorry, I didn't mean to get tearful with you all. His presence is just so good. And when he overwhelms you with his presence, you know you are standing in the midst of glory, in the midst of holy ground. And I consider it such a privilege that I was able to have that experience. So I just want to encourage all of you, to be mindful of the Lord's timing. We do not want to step outside of his timing. Don't make the same mistake I did. So when the Lord brings forth revelation, wait with it. Lay it before him and say, "Lord, show me the timing. Give us the divine strategy. Thank you for giving us this revelation, but we do not want to step outside of your timing. And so just pray and wait on the Lord, because he will bring you that divine strategy. So again, sorry, I'm all tearful, but I wanted to share again the mistakes that we've made to save you from making the same mistakes, so that you too don't have to buy a new car for going outside of God's timing. And I just want to encourage you, until next time, let's stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know your labor in the Lord is not in vain. Thanks for joining me.